In 1955, a young man named Petro underwent a profound and shocking experience that forever altered his understanding of life, death, and the universe. Just 2 days before his high school graduation, what seemed like a simple trip to a nearby lake turned into an extraordinary event beyond explanation. A desperate fight for survival led to a shocking encounter with a message that would change everything he thought he knew. It was a warm June day in 1955, one of those days when the air felt alive with excitement. Graduation was just 2 days away, marking the end of high school and the beginning of a new chapter. For Petro and his classmates, this was a time of anticipation, a moment to celebrate their years together before they all went their separate ways. The idea of a picnic by the lake seemed perfect, a carefree day of food, laughter, and memories to savor for a lifetime. The lake was a favorite spot for locals, its cool waters surrounded by tall trees and grassy shores. It wasn't particularly large, but it had a charm that made it feel special. There was a floating platform anchored in the middle of the lake, a favorite destination for swimmers. Reaching it felt like a small adventure, a playful challenge that most couldn't resist. The water, however, was notorious for its chilliness, especially in early summer. Michigan's lakes, fed by snowmelt and underground springs, stayed brisk long into the season. Andy and his friends arrived mid-morning, their spirits high. They spread out blankets on the grass, unpacked picnic baskets filled with sandwiches, potato salad, and bottles of soda, and settled into the day. The sun peeked through the clouds, casting shimmering patterns on the lake's surface. The laughter and chatter of the group blended with the calls of birds and the rustling of the trees. After lunch, a few of Andy's friends decided to head to the floating platform. Andy stayed behind, lying on his back in the grass, hands clasped behind his head, enjoying the warmth of the sun on his face. The thought of diving into that cold water didn't appeal to him. He had always loved swimming, but today, the idea of plunging into the icy depths seemed less appealing than just relaxing on the shore. From the corner of his eye, he noticed his friends waving at him from the platform. They were laughing, their shouts carrying across the water. "Come on, Andy," they called. He waved back, trying to signal he was fine where he was, but they kept gesturing for him to join them. Reluctantly, he sat up, brushing bits of grass off his clothes. He didn't want to disappoint them or appear hesitant, even though he could already feel the chill of the water just thinking about it. "All right," he muttered to himself, standing up and stretching. "Let's do this." The grass under his feet gave way to pebbles as he approached the water's edge. Taking a few quick breaths, he broke into a run and dove in. The shock of the cold water was immediate, like 1,000 tiny needles pricking his skin. He surfaced quickly, gasping, his body trembling as it adjusted. For a moment, he considered turning back, but his friends were still cheering him on from the platform. "Just keep moving," he thought, trying to ignore the cold. He struck out with a steady breaststroke, his arms slicing through the water, his legs kicking rhythmically. With each stroke, the platform seemed closer, but the cold seemed to seep deeper into his muscles. Halfway there, a sudden sharp pain gripped his abdomen. It wasn't a mild discomfort. It was a cramp so intense it stole his breath. His legs faltered, and he instinctively reached for his stomach, the movement throwing off his rhythm. Panic set in. His head dipped below the surface as he struggled to stay afloat. Kicking was nearly impossible with the cramp locking his lower body. He tried to tread water with his arms, but the effort only tired him further. He surfaced briefly, gasping for air, his lungs burning, and saw his friends on the platform. He waved frantically, but they waved back with smiles, mistaking his distress for playfulness. The water closed over his head again. He thrashed, but his movements felt sluggish, his energy draining rapidly. The cold, once a sharp shock, now felt like an oppressive weight pulling him down. He fought against it, his chest tightening as his body screamed for oxygen. For a fleeting moment, he broke the surface again, coughing and sputtering, but no sound came out. His arms flailed, trying to signal for help, but his friends were too far away to recognize the desperation in his movements. As he sank beneath the water once more, Andy's mind raced. Fear and disbelief consumed him. This couldn't be happening. He was too young, too full of life, to be facing death here, in this lake, surrounded by friends and a bright summer day. The thought of his parents, of all the things he hadn't done yet, flashed through his mind like a cruel taunt. He clawed at the water, but it offered no support, no relief. Deeper he went. The light from above dimmed, and the water grew colder still. His body felt heavier, the fight draining out of him with each passing second. His feet brushed against something soft. Lake weeds, he realized with a jolt. He had reached the bottom. Andy landed in a sitting position, the weeds tangling around him. He tried to push himself up, but his arms were too weak, his lungs too empty. The panic that had driven him moments ago gave way to a strange stillness. His thoughts slowed, his body no longer responding to his commands. He was slipping away, and he knew it. In that stillness, something unexpected happened. A voice, calm and reassuring, spoke in his mind. "Andy, let go. Rest. You need to rest." The words were soothing, almost hypnotic. He wanted to argue, to scream that he needed air, that he couldn't stop trying. But the voice continued, steady and certain. "Everything will be fine. Just let go." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Andy allowed himself to relax. The fight drained from his limbs, and his body went still. It was then, in that moment of surrender, that his world changed entirely. As Andy's body surrendered to the cold depths of the lake, something extraordinary began to happen. His awareness, once consumed by panic and desperation, shifted. A sense of stillness washed over him, as if the chaos of drowning had been paused in some unseen way. He felt his muscles relax, the tightness in his chest ease, and the sensation of the lake's coldness faded into the background. Then, with no warning, he felt as though he were weightless, detached from everything he had just been fighting against. The first thing Andy noticed was the profound silence. Underwater had always been quiet, but this was different. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a stillness that seemed to resonate deeply, like the world had fallen away and left only this serene emptiness. He felt himself moving, but not in the way he had been struggling before. There was no kicking or swimming. Instead, it felt as though he was being gently carried by an invisible force. He became aware of a glow in the distance. It started as a faint glimmer, like the first hint of dawn on a horizon, but it grew steadily, becoming brighter and more distinct. The light was warm and inviting, cutting through the darkness around him. Despite its intensity, it didn't hurt his eyes. In fact, it seemed to soothe him, pulling him closer with an irresistible magnetic quality. The transition was so smooth, so seamless, that Andy didn't even realize when he stopped being in the lake. One moment, he was surrounded by water and weeds. The next, he found himself in what can only be described as a tunnel. The walls of the tunnel were made of light, not the harsh, artificial kind, but a living, pulsating glow that felt alive. It radiated warmth, not just physical, but emotional, like the embrace of an old friend who'd been waiting for him. Andy floated effortlessly through the tunnel, the sensation of movement entirely out of his control, yet completely natural. He didn't feel rushed or afraid. Instead, there was a sense of deep relief, like shedding a heavy burden he hadn't realized he was carrying. For the first time since plunging into the lake, Andy felt he could breathe again. Not in the physical sense, but something deeper. It was as if every fiber of his being had been suffused with life and vitality. As he moved further along the tunnel, Andy noticed something remarkable. He wasn't alone. At first, it was just a subtle awareness, a sense of presence, like someone standing behind you, but not saying a word. Then, slowly, these presences became more distinct. He couldn't see them directly, but he could feel them. Countless beings surrounding him, their energy woven into the very fabric of the tunnel. They weren't intimidating or foreign. They felt familiar, like a part of him. And then there was the voice. It wasn't a sound he heard with his ears, but a communication that seemed to echo directly within his mind. The voice was calm, steady, and filled with an infinite kindness. "You're safe now," it said. The words weren't just reassuring, they carried a profound truth that left no room for doubt. Andy couldn't help but believe them because he could feel their sincerity. The tunnel began to widen as Andy continued forward, the light growing brighter and more encompassing. Time didn't seem to exist here. It wasn't that time was moving slowly or quickly, it simply wasn't a factor at all. Andy couldn't tell if he had been in the tunnel for moments or hours. The experience was all-encompassing, and his focus was entirely on the journey and the profound sense of peace that came with it. As he drew closer to the source of the light, Andy noticed how it seemed to hold all the colors of the rainbow, and yet none of them at the same time. It was pure, unfiltered brilliance, but it didn't overwhelm him. Instead, it felt welcoming, like the open door of a home he had always known, but somehow forgotten. The light didn't just shine, it spoke, not in words, but in feelings and understanding. It was as though Andy suddenly knew things he hadn't realized he was capable of knowing. Every question he had ever pondered seemed to have an answer, and that answer wasn't something told to him. It was something he remembered, something he already knew deep down. He wasn't gaining new knowledge. He was reconnecting with truths that had always been a part of him. As he reached the center of the light, Andy felt an overwhelming sensation of love. It wasn't the conditional kind of love he had known on Earth, the kind that came with expectations or strings attached. This was pure, unconditional and infinite. It filled every part of him, wrapping around his soul like the warmest embrace. It was a love that didn't just accept him for who he was, but celebrated him. Andy realized something else in that moment. He was no longer afraid. The fear of drowning, of leaving his life behind, had vanished entirely. In its place was a profound understanding that he hadn't lost anything at all. Instead, he had found something far greater, a connection to something eternal, something that transcended everything he had ever experienced. The light, the voice, and the beings around him all seemed to communicate one unified message. You are loved. You are safe. You are home. Andy couldn't remember a time when he had felt more alive. Even though his body was somewhere far away, lifeless at the bottom of a lake, he felt whole and complete for the first time. He didn't miss the earth, his life, or even his body. In this place, everything he had ever sought, love, peace, joy, was not only present, but infinite. For the first time in his existence, Andry understood what it meant to truly let go. It wasn't giving up, it was coming home. As Andry floated within the radiant embrace of the light, he became aware that he was no longer just a passive observer. He was part of something vast and alive, something that stretched far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The boundaries of his earthly life, his name, his memories, his identity, seemed to blur, but he wasn't losing himself. Instead, he was becoming more. He felt expansive, limitless, as though he had tapped into a well of universal knowledge and understanding. The light seemed to pulsate gently, not in a mechanical way, but in a rhythm that felt deeply connected to his being. It was as if the light itself were breathing, and Andry was breathing along with it. Then came the moment when the light began to communicate, not with words, but with thoughts, images, and feelings that flowed directly into him. The connection was seamless, like a conversation he had always been a part of, but had only just remembered. "You are here to understand," the light conveyed, "to see, to know, and to remember." Andry didn't have to ask questions because the answers came before he could even form them in his mind. The first thing the light revealed was his life. It began not as a series of disconnected events, but as a complete and interconnected story. Every moment he had lived, every joy, every sorrow, every seemingly insignificant choice was laid out before him in a way that felt simultaneously intimate and objective. The experience wasn't like watching a movie or flipping through a photo album. It was immersive. Andry could see and feel everything from his life as though he were living it again. He could step into any moment and feel not just his own emotions, but those of the people around him. If he had been angry at someone, he now felt their pain and confusion. If he had shown kindness, he felt their gratitude and joy. Each interaction, no matter how small, rippled outward in ways he had never realized. He saw himself as a child, running barefoot through the grass in the summer, his laughter echoing through the air. He felt the warmth of his mother's hand as she guided him across the street, the pride in his father's eyes when he learned to ride a bike. These moments, so fleeting in life, were now vivid and eternal. He understood how much they had shaped him and the people around him. But it wasn't all joy. The light showed him moments he had avoided thinking about, times he had hurt others, whether intentionally or not. He saw the disappointment on a friend's face when he broke a promise, the tears of someone he'd ignored in their time of need. Yet, even in these moments, the light did not judge him. It was as if the light was saying, "Look, see, understand. This is part of your journey." Andry realized the purpose of this review wasn't punishment or reward. It was clarity. It was about understanding the consequences of his actions, not as a way to measure his worth, but as a way to grow. He felt an overwhelming sense of compassion, not just for himself, but for everyone he had ever encountered. He saw how often people acted out of fear, pain, or misunderstanding, and he realized how deeply interconnected all lives were. The light also showed him moments he had forgotten entirely. Small acts of kindness, like helping a neighbor carry groceries or sharing a kind word with a classmate, had rippled outward in ways he could never have imagined. He saw how those moments had brightened someone's day, how they had influenced decisions and actions far beyond what he could have anticipated. It was humbling and awe-inspiring to see how even the smallest gestures could create waves of positivity. Then the light expanded his awareness beyond his current life. Andy saw glimpses of other lifetimes, some on Earth, some in places he couldn't fully comprehend. He saw himself as a woman in a distant past, tending to a family in a small, humble home. He saw himself as a traveler on a planet bathed in blue light, its skies filled with twin suns. Each life was unique, but they were all connected, part of a greater tapestry of experiences that stretched across time and space. Through it all, Andy felt the presence of the light as a guide and a companion. It wasn't there to tell him what to think or feel. It was there to help him remember who he truly was. He wasn't just Andy Petro, a high school senior in Michigan. He was a soul, eternal and infinite, having chosen this life as one chapter in a much larger story. At one point, Andy focused on a particularly difficult moment from his current life, a time when he had felt abandoned and alone. The memory brought back the sting of rejection and the weight of sadness. But as he relived it in the presence of the light, he saw it from a new perspective. He saw how that experience had taught him resilience, how it had deepened his capacity for empathy. The pain, once so overwhelming, now felt like a necessary step in his growth. "You are here to experience," the light conveyed, "to learn, to grow, to contribute to the whole." Andy realized that life wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about always making the right choices or avoiding mistakes. It was about being present, about embracing the messiness of existence and learning from it. The light showed him that every soul was on its own journey, each one contributing to a greater collective understanding. There was no hierarchy, no competition, only unity. Time didn't exist in this place, but eventually Andy felt the review drawing to a close. He had seen and understood so much, yet he felt there was still so much more to discover. The light seemed to sense his thoughts, and it responded with a feeling of gentle reassurance. "This is not the end," it conveyed. "You are always learning, always growing, and you are never alone." Andy felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He wasn't sure what was next, but he trusted the light completely. For the first time in his existence, he felt truly at peace. The light's embrace was complete, and Andy felt utterly whole, as though every part of his existence had aligned with a purpose he could now see clearly. He didn't feel like he was missing anything, not his body, his life, or the people he had left behind. Everything he had ever worried about seemed so far away, so inconsequential. Here, in the presence of the light, there was nothing but love, knowledge, and an indescribable sense of belonging. Then something changed. Andy felt a shift, subtle at first, like the faintest whisper of a breeze. The light, which had enveloped him so completely, began to speak in a way he hadn't experienced before. It wasn't just sharing knowledge or guiding him through his memories. This time, it was delivering a message he hadn't anticipated. "You must go back," the light conveyed. The words were like a sudden jolt, pulling him out of his serenity. Go back? The thought didn't make sense to him. He was home, finally, after what felt like an eternity of searching. Why would he leave this? Why would he return to a world that suddenly seemed so small and full of struggle? The light didn't pressure him, but repeated the message with a quiet firmness. "It's not your time. You still have work to do." Andy resisted the idea with everything in him. "No," he thought. Or maybe he said it aloud. He wasn't sure anymore. "I don't want to go back. I'm finally where I belong." The light didn't argue. It simply radiated understanding, wrapping Andry in its warmth, as if to say, "I know this is hard." But the message didn't change. It came again, gently but unwavering. "You must return. There are things you need to do." Andry's mind reeled. What could be more important than this? What could possibly justify leaving a place where he felt so utterly at peace? The idea of returning to the pain, the cold, the struggles of human life filled him with dread. He tried to plead with the light, to explain that he couldn't go back, that he wasn't strong enough. But the light didn't waver. "You are needed. Your time is not yet over." For a moment, Andry felt torn. On one hand, he trusted the light implicitly. It had shown him everything: his life, his purpose, the interconnectedness of all things. He knew it wouldn't ask him to leave without reason. But, on the other hand, the thought of returning filled him with such deep sorrow that it was almost unbearable. How could he leave behind this love, this completeness, and go back to a world that suddenly seemed so distant and dim? As if sensing his struggle, the light began to show him something new. It wasn't another life review or a glimpse of his past. This time, it was a vision of the future, a future he hadn't yet lived, but was meant to. Andry saw himself back in his body, surrounded by people who were listening to him, their faces filled with hope and wonder. He saw himself sharing the truths he had learned here, helping others find comfort and meaning in their own lives. He saw how his story would ripple outward, touching hearts he would never meet, and inspiring others to seek love and understanding. And then he felt it. A pull, gentle but insistent, like the tug of a current beneath the surface of the water. It wasn't forceful, but it was undeniable. The light didn't push him. It simply let him feel the truth of his own path. Deep down, Andry knew he wasn't finished. There was more for him to do, even if he didn't fully understand what it was yet. As the pull grew stronger, Andry felt the first pang of sadness. He didn't want to leave, but he realized that staying wasn't an option. The light didn't impose its will on him. It simply revealed the reality of his journey. And that journey wasn't over. "You will always carry this with you," the light conveyed. "What you have seen, what you have felt, it is a part of you now. It will guide you." Andry wanted to hold on for just a little longer, to stay in this place where everything made sense. But the pull was growing stronger, and he knew it was time. The light seemed to embrace him one last time, filling him with its warmth and love. And then, with a suddenness that was almost jarring, he felt himself moving again, not forward into the light, but backward, away from it. The journey back was nothing like the journey in. There was no tunnel, no gradual transition. It was as though he had been plucked from the embrace of the light and thrust into something heavy, cold, and dark. For a moment, Andry didn't understand what was happening. The weight, the resistance, the sharp pain in his chest, it all felt alien after the freedom he had just experienced. And then he realized he was back in his body. The return was brutal. His lungs burned as they forced out the water that had filled them. His chest ached from the rhythmic pressure of hands pushing down on him, trying to restart his heart. The cold of the lake clung to him, seeping into his bones, and his muscles felt weak and unresponsive. He coughed violently, the taste of the lake water sharp and bitter in his mouth. Voices surrounded him, panicked, relieved, disbelieving. Someone was shouting his name. "Andry! Andry, are you okay?" He couldn't respond. His throat felt raw, and his head was pounding. He opened his eyes, blinking against the harsh sunlight that seemed so different from the light he had just left behind. As he lay there, coughing and gasping, Andry felt an overwhelming sense of loss. The love, the peace, the oneness he had experienced, it all felt so far away now, like a dream that had slipped through his fingers. And yet, he couldn't deny that he had brought something back with him. Deep inside, he still felt the light's presence, a small but steady flame that refused to be extinguished. Even as he struggled to sit up, shivering and disoriented, Andry knew his life would never be the same. Something profound had happened to him, something he couldn't explain and wasn't sure anyone would believe. But one thing was certain: he had been given a second chance. And with that chance came a responsibility, a purpose he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. The days following Andry's return to life were a blur of physical recovery and emotional turmoil. He was alive, but he didn't feel whole. Something inside him had changed, and the world he had once known now felt unfamiliar. It wasn't just the trauma of nearly drowning. It was the memory of what he had experienced beyond the lake. A memory so vivid and profound that it felt more real than anything he'd ever known. But how could he explain it? How could he tell anyone about the light, the love, and the knowledge that had been shown to him? At first, Andry tried to brush it off. He convinced himself it was a hallucination, some trick of the brain during his near-death state. But the memory didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, replaying in his mind with such clarity that it felt as though he were still there. The love of the light, the interconnectedness of all things, the review of his life. It was all etched into his soul. He could feel it, like a steady hum in the background of his existence, reminding him that he had seen something far greater than anything this world could offer. Despite this, Andry remained silent. In 1955, there was no language for what he had experienced. Terms like near-death experience didn't exist, and he feared being dismissed as crazy or delusional. The culture of the time wasn't one that welcomed discussions about the afterlife or spiritual revelations. So he buried the experience deep inside, trying to go about his life as if nothing had changed. But it had changed. Andry found it impossible to see the world the same way. The petty worries and stresses that had once occupied his mind now seemed trivial. Arguments, grudges, and material concerns felt insignificant in the face of what he now understood. He saw people differently too, not as individuals separate from himself, but as part of a vast, interconnected whole. Each person he encountered carried a spark of the same light he'd experienced, even if they didn't realize it. This perspective brought Andry a strange mix of joy and loneliness. On one hand, he felt an immense compassion for everyone he met, understanding their struggles and fears in a way he never had before. On the other hand, he felt isolated, unable to share the depth of his experience with anyone. He wanted to tell them, to explain what he had seen and felt, but the words always failed him. How could he describe a love so infinite it defied comprehension? How could he explain the light's humor, its intelligence, its boundless joy? The years passed, and Andry carried the memory with him like a secret treasure. He went to college, got a job, and built a life that, from the outside, seemed ordinary. But inside, he was anything but ordinary. The light had left him with a sense of purpose, though it took him decades to fully understand what that purpose was. For a long time, Andry thought his experience was meant for him alone, a private gift to guide him through his own life. But over the years, he began to notice something. Whenever he spoke to someone, Whether it was a friend, a colleague, or a stranger, he had an uncanny ability to make them feel seen and understood. People opened up to him in ways they hadn't before, sharing their fears, hopes, and struggles. Andy listened with an open heart, offering words of comfort that seemed to flow from somewhere beyond himself. He started to see how the light's message of love and interconnectedness wasn't just for him. It was for everyone. The world was full of people who felt lost, alone, and disconnected, and Andy realized he could be a bridge for them. He didn't have to preach or try to convince anyone of his experience. He just had to live in a way that reflected the truths he had learned. By showing kindness, patience, and understanding, he could share the light without ever needing to mention it. It wasn't until decades later that Andy finally found the courage to speak openly about his experience. In the late 1970s, he came across a book called Life After Life by Dr. Raymond Moody, the first to describe what would later be called near-death experiences. As Andy read the accounts of others who had seen the light, he felt tears streaming down his face. For the first time, he realized he wasn't alone. He wasn't crazy. What he had experienced was real, and others had experienced it too. The realization was liberating. Andy began to share his story, tentatively at first, with close friends and family. To his surprise, many of them listened with open minds, even if they couldn't fully understand. Over time, he found more opportunities to speak, sharing his experience with groups and eventually writing about it. The more he shared, the more he saw how deeply people resonated with the message of the light. Andy's story wasn't about convincing others of an afterlife or proving the existence of the light. It was about reminding people of the love and connection that already existed in their lives. He often told audiences, "You don't have to die to experience the light. It's here, all around us, in the kindness we show, in the joy we create, in the love we give and receive." As he continued to share his story, Andy noticed something else. The more he talked about the light, the closer he felt to it. He realized that his purpose wasn't just to live a life guided by the light's teachings, but to help others see the light within themselves. Every act of kindness, every moment of forgiveness, every time someone chose love over fear, it was all part of the same eternal connection. Andy never stopped longing for the day he would return to the light, but he no longer feared the wait. He knew that everything he did here was part of the same journey, part of the same infinite love that had embraced him all those years ago. And when the time finally came for him to go home, he knew the light would be waiting, not as a stranger, but as an old friend. Through his life, Andy became a living testament to the light's message, that we are all one, that we are all loved, and that the purpose of life is not to achieve or accumulate, but to experience, to grow, and to share joy with one another.